The royal decree went out on the winter solstice, a day when the sky over the Ironbark territory was the color of a bruised plum. In our world, the solstice is more than a change of seasons. It is a spiritual threshold. For the Ironbark wolves, it was the day their mourning officially ended and a new, colder era began. Every unmated she-wolf in the territory knew exactly what the parchment pinned to the great hall's massive oak doors meant. Alpha Silas Thorne was finally ready to replace his dead Luna. Silas was 38 years old, a man whose presence felt like a thunderstorm held behind a dam. He had been Alpha for 12 years, but the last 6 had been spent in a hollowed-out silence. His mate, Luna Elena, had been the soul of the pack. She was the one who remembered the names of the widows, the one who brought honey to the elders, the one who softened Silas's jagged edges. She had died giving birth to their second child, a daughter who lived for exactly 4 hours, long enough to take one breath of mountain air before following her mother into the great beyond. The birth had been a scene of carnage that the pack's healers still whispered about in hushed tones. The blood wouldn't stop. The magic wouldn't hold. And standing in the corner of that room, unnoticed in the chaos, was their firstborn son, 5-year-old Caleb. He had seen it all. He had seen the life drain from his mother's face. He had heard the silence that followed his sister's last, weak cry. Something in the boy's mind had simply snapped. The healers called it trauma-induced paralysis. There was no spinal injury, no torn muscle. His legs simply refused to obey. It was as if his body had decided that if he couldn't run away from that horrific night, he would never move again. 6 years later, Caleb was 11, confined to a wheeled chair of iron and leather. He was a ghost in his own home, and the pack was getting restless. A pack without a Luna is a pack without a heart, and the Ironbark wolves were becoming cold, efficient, and cruel. "You need a Luna, Silas," his beta, Kalen Voss, said for the 100th time. They were in the Alpha's private study, a room that smelled of old books and the underlying scent of cedar and pine. The borders are being pressed by the Nightclaw pack. The internal disputes among the mining families are escalating. You are drowning in grief, and you are taking the pack down with you. Silas turned from the window, his eyes like flint. "And what would you have me do? Bring a woman in here to play mother to a boy who hasn't laughed in 6 years? To a boy who stares at the wall until the sun goes down? That is exactly why the test must be what it is," Kalen argued. "Don't look for a beauty. Don't look for a politician. Use Caleb as the filter. Any wolf can pretend to be kind for an hour, but no one can fake the soul required to care for your son for a full moon cycle." And so, the decree was written. It contained a condition that made the blood of every ambitious she-wolf run cold. Whoever wishes to wear the silver crown of Ironbark must first prove herself worthy by caring for the Alpha's son, Caleb Thorne, for 1 full moon cycle. She shall live in the family wing, alone with the child, under the eyes of the pack. If she breaks, if she falters, if she shows even a moment of resentment toward the heir, she is banished from the succession. It was brutal. It was a social death trap. Yet 17 women stepped forward. Candidate 1, Lady Marcella, was the daughter of a wealthy merchant. She lasted 3 days. She was caught by a kitchen maid whispering that Caleb was a creepy little gargoyle because he wouldn't speak to her. Silas kicked her out before sunset. Candidate 7, Genevieve, was a high-ranking warrior. She thought tough love was the answer. She tried to starve Caleb until he found the strength to walk to the table. Silas almost shifted and tore her apart in the dining hall. By the time Candidate 17, a beautiful, poised woman named Bianca from the Southern Reach, packed her bags in tears, the pack had reached a breaking point. Bianca had been the best of them, and even she had snapped, calling Caleb an anchor dragging the Alpha into the abyss. The pack whispered that the Alpha was sabotaging the search. They said he didn't want a Luna. He wanted to be alone with his ghosts. And then, Lyra Bellin walked into the hall. Lyra was 24, an Omega who had spent her life invisible. She cleaned the floors of the Pack Hospital, scrubbing away the evidence of other people's pain. She had no family, no status, and no beauty that hadn't been weathered by hard labor. But she had seen Caleb at the hospital. She had seen him being wheeled in for his treatments, doctors poking him with needles, healers trying to shock his nerves back to life, while Silas stood over him, radiating a desperate, suffocating pressure to be better. Lyra had been the one to fix his wheel when it got stuck. She hadn't looked at Silas. She had looked at Caleb and said, "These floors are a mess, aren't they? I'm Lyra. I'm the one who has to clean them, so if you want to make a mess later, just let me know so I can bring the right mop." Caleb had blinked. It was the first time someone had spoken to him without pity. Now, standing in the great hall before the Alpha and the Elders, Lyra looked like a sparrow among hawks. The Elders, Hagar, Mira, and Thorne, sat in their high-backed chairs, their expressions etched with disdain. "You wish to be considered for the Luna trial," Elder Hagar sneered. "An Omega? You realize, girl, that this is not a cleaning job. You would be expected to lead. You would be expected to represent us." Lyra didn't look at Hagar. She looked at the silver crown sitting on the velvet cushion on the table. It was a beautiful thing, forged from moonlight and tradition. Then she looked at Caleb, who sat in the shadows behind his father's throne, looking smaller than ever. She felt a surge of cold fury. This boy wasn't a trial. He wasn't a test. He was a child being used as a pawn in a game of bloodlines. "I have something to say." Lyra's voice was quiet, but it carried to every corner of the room. Silas leaned forward, his interest piqued for the first time in weeks. "Speak, Omega." Lyra walked to the table. She didn't touch the crown. She looked at Silas and said 2 words that shattered 500 years of Ironbark tradition. "I refuse." The hall went silent. You could hear the crackle of the torches on the walls. "You refuse?" Silas asked, his voice low and dangerous. "You come here, into my hall, to refuse the trial you petitioned for." "I refuse to be a candidate," Lyra said, her voice growing stronger. "I refuse to participate in a pageant where a traumatized child is the obstacle to be overcome. I will care for Caleb. I will move into the manor tonight. I will do exactly what your decree asks. But I will not do it for that crown. I will do it because this boy is being raised by people who see him as a problem to be solved, and he deserves to be seen as a person to be known." She looked at the Elders. "And if, after 30 days, Caleb is happy, then you can decide if an Omega is worthy of your silver. But until then, keep your crown. It's too heavy for someone who actually has work to do. If that moment just sent chills down your spine, subscribe right now, because what happens next will destroy you in the best possible way. Tell me the city you're watching from in the comments so I can send you a digital hug. You're going to need it for this journey." Lyra moved into the family wing that evening. She brought nothing but a small bag of clothes and a collection of dried herbs. She didn't ask for servants. In fact, she dismissed the ones who were already there. "I don't need someone to carry the water," she told the head housekeeper. "I need everyone to stay out of this wing unless I call for you. Caleb needs to hear his own voice, not the sound of 10 people whispering about how sad he is." The first 3 days were a battle of wills. Caleb wouldn't speak. He wouldn't eat anything she cooked. He sat by the window, staring at the training grounds where the other children were learning to shift and hunt. Lyra didn't push him. She didn't try to make him walk. Instead, she sat on the floor near his chair and did her own work. She mended clothes. She sorted seeds. She sang low, humming songs from the Omega bunks, songs about the moon and the earth, things that didn't care about rank. On the 4th night, Caleb finally broke the silence. "Why are you here?" he asked. His voice was raspy, like dry leaves. "You're just going to leave like the others." Bianca cried because I wouldn't smile for her. "Are you going to cry?" Lyra didn't look up from the sock she was darning. "I've got plenty to cry about, Caleb, but none of it has to do with your face. I'm here because I like the view from this window, and I like the quiet. If you want to talk, we talk. If you want to sit in silence, I'm the best silent partner you'll ever find. Caleb watched her. You're an Omega. My father is an Alpha. My mother was an Alpha. They say you aren't supposed to be here. They say a lot of things, Lyra said, finally looking at him. They say your legs don't work, but I think they work just fine. I think they're just waiting for a reason to move that isn't about making your father happy. Silas, standing in the corridor outside the open door, felt a pang of guilt so sharp it nearly brought him to his knees. He had been so focused on Caleb walking, on Caleb being the heir, that he had never considered that the boy was paralyzed by the weight of expectations, not just grief. While Lyra and Caleb were building a fragile bridge of trust, the pack was festering. Elder Hagar was not a man who took insults lightly. He saw Lyra's presence as a direct threat to the hierarchy he had spent 70 years protecting. The Alpha is being charmed by a commoner, Hagar told a secret assembly of the pack's elite. She has dismissed the staff. She spends her nights alone with him. She is poisoning the air against his own rank. If Silas names her Luna, we lose our standing with the neighboring packs. We become a laughingstock. They began a campaign of subtle terror. Lyra would find her room trashed. Her herbs were replaced with poisonous lookalikes. The other Omegas, terrified of being associated with her, turned their backs when she passed. One evening, while Lyra was returning from the kitchens with a tray of food, she was cornered by Vance, a high-ranking warrior and Hagar's nephew. You think you're special, don't you? Vance sneered, pinning her against the stone wall. You think, because the Alpha is lonely, you can climb out of the dirt. You're still an Omega, Lyra. You're built for the floor. Maybe I should remind you what happens to wolves who forget their place. He backhanded her. It wasn't enough to break bone, but it was enough to split her lip and leave a dark bruise blooming on her cheek. If you're still here tomorrow, Vance hissed, it won't be your face I hit. It'll be the boy's chair. Lyra didn't cry. She didn't go to Silas. She went back to Caleb's room, wiped the blood from her mouth, and served him dinner. But Caleb saw. He saw the bruise. He saw the way her hand shook as she poured his water. Who did that? Caleb asked, his voice trembling with a new kind of energy. It's nothing, Caleb. I tripped. You didn't trip, Caleb said. For the first time he reached out and touched her hand. They're hurting you because of me, because I'm broken. No, Lyra said firmly, kneeling so she was eye level with him. They're hurting me because they're afraid. They're afraid that if an Omega can do a better job than a princess, then the world they've built is a lie. You are not a burden, Caleb. You are the only person in this house who is actually awake. The middle of the cycle was the hardest. The pressure from the council reached a fever pitch. Silas was being challenged at every meeting. The 30 days are almost up, Elder Mira pressured. You must choose a candidate from the approved list. This Omega has had her fun, but the boy is still in the chair. She has failed. He is talking, Silas growled. He is eating. He is sleeping through the night without screaming for his mother. That is a nanny's work, not a Luna's, Hagar shouted. A Luna must lead the warriors. She must negotiate treaties. Can this girl even read a map? Silas began to doubt himself. Not because of Lyra's worth, but because he feared he was leading her to the slaughter. If he named her Luna, the council would make her life a living hell. Was his love for her? And he realized now, with a terrifying clarity, that he did love her. A death sentence? In the manor, the atmosphere changed. Caleb was no longer the passive observer. He began to ask Lyra to help him move his legs. Not to walk, but to stretch. He wanted to sit on the floor with her. I remember the night it happened, Caleb whispered one night. The moon was nearly full, casting long silver fingers into the room. The room smelled like copper. My mother's hand was so cold. I thought if I didn't move, the darkness wouldn't see me. I thought if I stayed perfectly still, I could stay in that moment before she died. Lyra took his hand. "The darkness sees us all, Caleb. But the light does too. And your mother didn't want you to stay in that room. She wanted you to take her heart out, into the world." That night, for the first time in 6 years, Caleb Thorne stood up. It wasn't a miracle. It was a struggle. He held on to the back of his chair, his legs shaking like saplings in a hurricane. He stayed upright for 5 seconds before collapsing back down, sweat pouring off his face. Lyra didn't cheer. She didn't call for Silas. She just leaned over and kissed his forehead. 5 seconds, that's a lifetime, Caleb. Tomorrow, we try for 6. The day before the final moon, the council decided to act. They knew that if the 30 days ended, Silas would have the legal right to name Lyra Luna. They had to get rid of her before the sun set. Vance and 2 other warriors intercepted Lyra in the gardens. They didn't use words this time. They dragged her toward the border, toward the no-man's land where rogues and outcasts lived. "The Alpha will think you ran away," Vance said, his grip like iron on her arm. "He'll think you realized you weren't good enough and fled in the night. And by the time he finds your body, the rogues will have picked it clean." They threw her into a ravine at the edge of the territory. Lyra hit the ground hard, her ankle snapping with a sickening pop. As she lay there in the cold mud, watching the warriors walk away, Lyra felt the old Omega instinct to just stay down, to accept the dirt. But then she thought of Caleb. She thought of him waiting for her to come back and count his 6 seconds. She began to crawl. The great hall was packed. It was the night of the solstice, exactly 1 moon cycle since the decree. The silver crown sat on the table, glowing under the light of the massive chandeliers. Silas stood on the dais, his face a mask of agony. Lyra was gone. Her room was empty. No one had seen her since the afternoon. "It seems your Omega has proven us right," Hagar said, his voice dripping with false sympathy. "She couldn't handle the pressure. She fled." "She wouldn't leave him," Silas whispered. "She wouldn't leave Caleb." "The evidence says otherwise, Alpha," Hagar said, gesturing to the empty space where the trial was supposed to stand. "Now, we must move on. My granddaughter, Alara, is prepared to step in." "No!" a voice rang out from the back of the hall. The crowd parted. Caleb was there. He wasn't in his chair. He was leaning on a heavy wooden staff, his face pale but determined. He was walking. Each step was a battle, a slow, deliberate movement of bone and will. "Lyra didn't leave," Caleb said, his voice echoing in the sudden silence. "She was taken." Silas was off the dais in a second, catching his son as he nearly stumbled. "Caleb? You're walking?" "She taught me how," Caleb said, tears streaming down his face. "She told me the darkness doesn't win unless we let it. Papa, Vance took her. I saw them from the window. They took her to the North Rim." Silas's growl was not human. It was the sound of a predator whose world had just been threatened. He turned to Vance, who was standing near Hagar, his face pale. But before Silas could move, the heavy oak doors of the hall swung open. Lyra was there. She was a mess. Her clothes were torn, her face was covered in mud and blood, and she was dragging her broken leg behind her. She used a fallen branch as a crutch. She didn't look at the warriors. She didn't look at the council. She looked at Caleb. "You're standing," she whispered. "I'm standing, Lyra," he cried. She managed to limp to the center of the hall before her strength gave out. Silas caught her before she hit the floor. "You stayed," Silas breathed, pulling her into his chest. "Why did you come back?" Lyra looked at the council, at the men who had spent their lives telling her she was nothing. "Because I had a job to do. And because I refused to let people like them win." The elders tried to intervene. "This is a circus. She is a mess. She is an Omega who has caused nothing but chaos," Hagar shouted. Silas stood up, Lyra still in his arms. He looked at his pack, the warriors, the mothers, the children, the Omegas who were watching from the back. "For 6 years I was a king in a tomb," Silas said. "I looked for a Luna who could represent my power. I looked for a woman who could fit into the mold of Elena. But Elena didn't want a mold. She wanted a heart. And Lyra Belen has given this pack its heart back." He walked to the table and picked up the silver crown. "Lyra," he said, his voice cracking, "I'm not asking you to take this crown as a reward for a trial. I'm asking you to take it because without you, I am just a man in a dark room. Will you be our Luna?" Lyra looked at the crown. She looked at the blood on her hands. She looked at the Omegas in the back of the room, the ones who were finally standing up straight because they saw one of their own being honored. "I have one condition," Lyra said. "Anything," Silas replied. "The hierarchy ends tonight," she said. "No more Omega status as a birthright. No more rank that determines if a child gets a healer or a floor. If I am Luna, I am the Luna of the whole pack, not just the elite. We lead together, or I go back to the hospital." The silence was longer this time. It was the sound of a world shifting. "Together," Silas said. He placed the crown on her head. The moment the silver touched her brow, a brilliant light erupted. It wasn't the fake light of the chandeliers. It was the moon goddess's blessing. Lyra's eyes turned a brilliant, glowing silver, and the bruise on her face vanished. Her ankle knit back together. The goddess didn't just approve, she claimed. The pack fell to their knees, not out of fear, but out of awe. The months that followed were not easy. Revolutions never are. Hagar and his loyalists tried to spark a rebellion, but they found that they had no soldiers. The warriors, inspired by Caleb's recovery and Lyra's grit, refused to fight for the old ways. Caleb never went back to the chair. He walked with a limp for a year, a reminder of the battle he had won, but eventually, even that faded. He became the most compassionate leader the Ironbark had ever seen, a boy who knew that strength was found in vulnerability. Silas and Lyra didn't have a fairy tale marriage at first. They had to learn each other. They had to navigate the scars of his past and the trauma of her life as an outcast. But they did it with the same stubbornness that had brought them together. Lyra kept her hospital mops. She had them gold-plated and hung in the great hall, a reminder to everyone who walked through those doors that the person who cleans the floors is just as important as the person who sits on the throne. If this story moved you, if you've ever felt like an Omega in an Alpha's world, hit that subscribe button right now. This story is for the invisible ones. It's for the ones who refuse the crown until it's offered on their own terms. Tell me in the comments, what is one tradition in your own life that you think needs to be refused? And don't forget to tell me your city so I can send you that hug. You've finished the journey. You've seen the revolution. Until next time, keep your heart open and your spirit loud. The moon is always watching,